I've called my session Reimagining Learning, and I've called it Reimagining Learning so that I really want to focus on shifting the paradigm, just to think big and not small about the way learning relates to work. Because I think if there's any second in this last 10 years where we should be doing that, it's now. As we come out of the pandemic, as organizations are going through a real reimagination themselves, learning has to follow suit, or the learning professionals in organizations will marginalize themselves. I think that's a little bit clearer now. So I've called my session From Safe Spaces to Brave Spaces. And that's a title that I stole from a journal article from about 2013, looking at diversity and social justice, and saying that we had to move into brave spaces to make progress and share authenticity in the room. And in some ways, I think the challenge is equally true for learning. We have to be more authentic, and we have to do things not just a little bit differently around the margins, but we have to do things radically differently. And that's illustrated, I think, in this next slide. In many ways, we are really good at the design stuff. We make it neat and tidy. It looks good. It's got the right amount of paving all lined up with the right amount of underpinning beneath it so it doesn't fall apart in the first storm. Great design, sadly in the wrong place. And I think we're missing two things, and I'm slightly obsessed by these two words, so I'll keep coming back to them, if I may, during this talk. The first thing I think we're missing is the concept of field work. We don't get out there enough. We take what people say, tell us is the problem, at face value, and we build on assumptions far, far too quickly. Field work is about being there, listening, observing, taking stock yourself. And in working in the field, you are building your practice. You're becoming focused on developing as a practitioner, being more relevant, more connected as your career progresses. But we don't focus on practice in the way that a doctor or a dentist does, and we hardly do any field work. And I was struck by how relevant the term is. That quote there, we listen and learn from the world around us. That was a Microsoft employee trying to describe the culture of the company. We listen and learn from the world around us. If that isn't field work, then please explain to me what is. And that cultural change in Microsoft to make it a more engaged, a more learning, thoughtful, integrated company has shown spectacular results. And it has become relevant in a way that perhaps before Nadella arrived in 2014, no one would have ever guessed or imagined. Microsoft had been boring and pedestrian and not really there in the world. Under Nadella, it's become dramatically relevant. And if you look at Microsoft Teams, in some ways, Teams reflects Nadella's philosophy. Teams isn't a brand new product built from the floor up. Teams is bolting together maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 different products, from SharePoint through to Office, through to Skype, through to the analytics engines, and fitting it in a coordinated framework that suits people, that came at exactly the right moment for the pandemic. So Teams became Microsoft's fastest growing, fastest selling, fastest adopted product in the history of the company. Not because it was particularly flash, not because the user interface was particularly brilliant, but it worked and it integrated everything we needed in one spot. Microsoft had done their field work and they built their practice, and they worked across the whole organization, not in silos. So I think that learning has to do something similar if it's going to really reflect the needs of organizations as we move forward. And I like this conception from Martina Theodotou. It's in a book that ATD published, which was edited by Tamara Elkeles. It came out, I think, last year. And she defines 5 elements of a learning ecosystem. And I just want to share those with you because I think it's quite important that we don't equate learning ecosystem with buying a technology platform. And the salespeople will have you believe that that is a learning ecosystem. What more could you want? Well, the answer is you can want quite a lot more. And you start not with technology, but with people. You work out what they need and when they need it and how they need it. You focus on the kind of content that might meet those needs. And that can be incredibly formal, incredibly informal and social, or a combination of those. You work out the data that you need to collect that helps the learner at the front end and helps the organization understand what's happening at the back end. And then you decide on an appropriate technology platform or a collection of smaller platforms. And one of the interesting things that's happening in our little learning ecosystem is the number of specialist ed tech startups doing amazing work and being very proud of specializing not in end-to-end talent management, but just one thing, doing mentoring really well, like Grasp HR do, or some other focus, or even bolting together elements like Slack into a learning ecosystem. Slack can work in learning. It's never built to do that. But if that's what people know and love, you can turn it into a part of your learning ecosystem. Not the whole thing, but you can turn it into part of it. But even those 4 are not enough. The key one sitting there on the top right is governance. And often we forget governance. And governance isn't what learning does. Governance is handing the ecosystem over to the organization to oversee and to keep tabs on and to do their own field work about its fitness for purpose, and therefore to evolve it either rapidly or steadily as needs change, as the world becomes more uncertain and more volatile. We forget about governance, which is the bridge into the organization. And we often forget about people when we build learning ecosystems. We just focus on the technology. So I think if you are going to go from those safe spaces into a brave space, you have to work through the complexity of managing all those different interests rather than the simplicity of just cutting everything else out and going for one only. And I also believe that that is a process that is dangerous. You're taking people out of a comfort zone where they might have lived for 10 years or 5 years or even longer. And when you get out of your comfort zone, discovering new ways of working, new paradigms, building a new relationship with the organization, having those conversations, it can feel dangerous, but you move from danger into that learning zone. So there's that shift. And once you've got out of your comfort zone, you never go back. You stay on that edge, if you like, between danger and learning, making sure that you're psychologically safe, the organization is psychologically safe, but able to take in new information, build and continue to learn continuously. So it's a totally different experience and a completely different process. And I want to echo Etienne Wenger's wise words. He married someone called Bev Trainer, so he's now Etienne Wenger Trainer, but this is Etienne Wenger of Communities of Practice fame. And I've put his most famous book cover underlying my slide, so you can see that. Communities of Practice, Learning, Meaning, and Identity. And I think that Etienne made some very important points in a recent video interview that Marion Neelan who everyone, I think, certainly in Learnovate is very familiar with. Marion said that, Etienne said, when challenged about the nature of communities of practice, that the big mistake is assuming that learning is about the transmission of certainty, where it's really increasingly in an uncertain environment about engagement around uncertainty. Now, if you analyze learning and development in organizations, how many of them are still in the business of transmitting certainty and not really engaging around uncertainty in any way, and not really engaging in the way that Etienne is talking about? So for him, a community of practice, I think in the interview, someone said, it's community of practice about sharing, Etienne. Of course, it's not about sharing. Sharing is a byproduct. Who wants to go somewhere and share, be told to share? What you want to go and focus on is helping people through complexity and uncertainty. And in that process, sharing occurs. But that's not the purpose. And he also talks about learning as an experience of being human in the world. Now, how many organizations are using learning as a way of humanizing, not dehumanizing the workforce? How many organizations recognize that if you can create a whole organization full of people who are able to cope and feel much better about themselves and much more aligned and integrated into a strong community, that there will be a massive payback benefit to the organization as a whole. So it's all about being meaningful to whom we are. And this is Etienne Wenger talking about communities of practice and organizations. It's about being meaningful to whom we are as we learn to live in complex societies. And I actually think he's making a really profound point, because not only are we learning to live in complex societies, the workplace is highly complex and getting more complex. We have to learn to survive in complex organizations, which are in complex societies, increasingly uncertain organizations, in increasingly uncertain societies. And that process of engagement and acculturation can't be done without learning, but it can't be done in isolation. We tend to serve learning in dollops for individuals on the plate. There's a menu and you get that, you get that. You can change the first course, or you can have 3 sides, not 4, but it's basically giving people, individuals, things to do, things to absorb, things to learn. Whereas I think that understanding what an organization needs is about more than simply offering some solution that creates certainty, rather than, as the slide says, mutual engagement around uncertainty. So communities sustain practice around a learning community. So we sustain practice, organizations sustain themselves, organizations learn to cope, organizations focus on adjusting to cope with that world around learning. I may be wrong, but I can't see any other way that they can sustain themselves apart from around learning. But this isn't superficial. This is a profound integration. And it's like learning becomes part of the meaning of the organization. And that is big change, I think, big radical change. So this is a quote from Viktor Frankl. He was an Auschwitz survivor, and he wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning, in 1946, straight after he got back to Vienna after the war. And this quote has haunted me for years. And I think it's, again, very useful just to reflect on it. Viktor Frankl was having very big thoughts. I'm having quite small thoughts in a way, but I still think that there's a truth in what he says. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And so much learning and development, there is no space between stimulus and response. In many organizations, learning and development is stimulus, problem, instant response, challenge, instant solution. I think we do have a choice. In that space between stimulus and response, there's the power to choose the response. And maybe that is not to offer an instant solution. Maybe it's to investigate. Maybe it's to do some more field work. Maybe it's to advance our practice. Maybe it's to think hard in discussion with other people about the nature of the problem and the underlying problem and the problem that underlies the underlying problem, rather than simply react from stimulus to response. So in that space is our growth. Maybe I'm putting it a bit hard to say in our freedom, but certainly in our space, there's a chance to reflect and grow and engage and understand at a profound level what is needed in an organization, not an instant knee-jerk response. And that kind of made me think about WD-40 Company. This is Gary Ridge's slide. So I borrowed it from Gary. And Gary has done an amazing job in WD-40. He turned it from a 200 million market cap company that sells fluid in a tin to a $2.4 billion market cap company that still sells fluid in a tin. And he did it through focusing on building a really strong learning community in his organization, and a brave community that could tackle new markets in different ways. And so when the pandemic hit WD-40, I asked Gary, what did that do? Most of your sales are in shops and they're all closed. And he said, it was not a problem at all. We realized what we needed to do and we just did it. They switched to online, they switched to suppliers who were working online, and they hardly missed a beat. The company hardly had any impact, just a very, very temporary small impact. But if you look at Gary, what he's saying is that learning and teaching, it's the biggest circle, quite deliberately, the biggest circle there. But he's saying that it only makes sense if it connects all the others. It doesn't sit out on its own. It doesn't work in abstract, and it doesn't work away from the values and the sense of belonging and building warriors. He calls his teams warriors in the organization. It does develop skills, and it is about not focusing on selling oil in a can today, but the nature of the world tomorrow. So there's a big future focus in his operation. But the point is that it only works because it's joined together. And he sees learning and teaching as the most important glue that holds the rest of the culture of the organization together. But it's not separate, it's integrated. The problem is that in many organizations, we kind of shutter out everything apart from skill development and learning and teaching. So we just keep the curtains closed, and we never peek behind them because it's uncomfortable and it's difficult. So I think it's really important we listen to the successful organizations, the Microsofts and the WD-40s and many more, and try to understand how dramatically different their concept of learning in the organization is, and how much it's integrated into not just work, but the way everyone thinks about their work and approaches their work, as well as the work itself. So it's this sort of balance. This is from Matthew Bidwell. I teach with him at Wharton, and Matthew said something very, very simply, just scrawled it on a whiteboard. And he just said that if you have skills, but no motivation, you might as well not have the skills. If you feel empowered, but you don't have the skills, then nothing is going to happen, or very dangerous things will happen because you don't know what you're doing. If you have motivation and empowerment without the skills, then there's a massive gap and a huge inefficiency in the organization. So Matthew's saying the simple aim is holistic. You've got to focus on the bigger picture around people their skill needs, their sense of purpose and motivation and engagement and empowerment. And it's when those things come together that you find you have something important going on in the organization, and something dramatic, and an ability to redefine, re-engage, rebuild whatever the world throws at you. Without that, you end up with paralysis. And I was really struck working with huge numbers of organizations in the early day of COVID, that some organizations just seemed to get it. They just went ahead and they rebuilt their systems, and they kept the customers happy, and they continued to deliver as much as they possibly could, while other organizations were paralyzed, completely paralyzed, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. And that's all about an attitude to learning and an attitude to motivation and engagement and empowerment. It's about skills, but it's absolutely not just about skills. So this is going to sound perhaps slightly crazy, but I think, and all of my research that I've been doing in the last year has focused on something remarkable in learning organizations, and that is the learning happens in the spaces between people. If you have an organization that concentrates on individuals and makes individuals really great, that's helpful and useful. But can you imagine the additional value if the connections between those people are vibrant and alive, so they can ask, they can partner, they can sit together and problem solve, they can admit what they don't know, they can work around what they do know. You get something dramatic happening in an organization. So I've said what matters are the connections. The connections are what distinguishes a learning organization from other organizations. And I got into a bit of trouble by saying there's a massive difference between a learning culture and a culture of learning. And people think I'm just playing around with semantics. But a culture of learning is when everyone learns. Individually, they've got their program and they've got their pathways and they've got their skill profiles and all of that stuff. But that is not the same as a learning culture, where what matters is how the organization itself builds its own learning. And there was a lot of research on learning organizations in the 1990s, which just seems to have floated away for some reason. And I actually think it's really important, and we ought to re-engage with that. So in my head, the metaphor I have, and I'm careful about what I'm saying in the august company I'm with at the moment, but I see a learning organization, it's rather like an organization's brain. Our brain is powerful because of its connections, not because of its density. Otherwise, elephants will be the smartest animals on the planet. We learn and grow through building neural connections and new pathways. And if we continue to do that, that makes us adept and smarter than perhaps smarter than other people. And it's the density of our connections that matter. And if we can keep those connections firing through our life, that will protect us. We don't know how much, but certainly it will protect us a bit from potential dementia and other brain problems later in life. Learning, firing neurons, building connections is incredibly important in our brain. And I think that it's incredibly important in an organization. So if you could draw all the lines between all of those people, we get something far more complex than just focusing on cultivating the individual. It just seems to me to be absolutely central that an organization that can cope with uncertainty needs to have and be able to draw upon all of the insights of all of the people all of the time. And if you have a focus on individual learning and focus on building a culture of learning, then people leave, things change, and the organization falls apart. In a learning organization, the insights are already shared. Nothing stays in one head. Everything is moved across the organization and things are worked on collectively. And to me, that is the most exciting development arena. That's like a cauldron of ideas. And that Microsoft, young member of Microsoft staff, who I discussed at the beginning, that's what she describes Microsoft as, a cauldron of ideas, where our field work, we experiment coming back from our field work to make the products and the solutions that we know that our customers want, or they don't know they want, but we know, or we have insights that they might want them. And that just changes the whole atmosphere inside the place from the Baumer era, when everyone was fighting everyone else and everything was in divisions and divisions divided, and every member of staff was fighting the rest of their team because everyone was graded into 4 boxes, and if you were in the bottom box, you were likely to be chucked out. So your job was to make sure that you appeared to be at least better than the 10th in the group in order to survive. So it's a really toxic, unhealthy, individualistic culture. But Nardella has done the most amazing work trying to sort out and basically transform. So this is my model of a learning culture. And it comes from the book, which has just come out in a 2nd edition. And I still think it's valid. And it kind of picks up on all the things that everybody has said in the people I'm quoting in this talk, that if you don't focus on the big things like building trust, empowerment and engagement, and a leadership that reflects those, you'll never get an environment where people are willing to collaborate, where there is a sense of purpose. And then on top of that, the autonomy to do really good work and share. And it's only when you've got those 2 inner layers working that we get to the heart of it, which is the learning culture. And I see learning culture like an organizational gyroscope. It's the energy that spins and allows organizations to understand how their external environment is changing and take action, corrective action, as soon as they possibly can. So just like a pilot has a gyroscope that indicates the artificial horizon, then learning is the gyroscope in organizations, which indicates the organizational horizon and tells the organization whether it's facing in the wrong direction and how it needs to change to keep track of the turbulence and the volatility that it's going through. So to talk about learning in organizations, I can't see how you can extract that from the whole, that the organization as a whole, because the organization as a whole is complex and fascinating and requires learning at its heart, but integrated into its heart to be able to transform, self-correct, and all of those other things. So I want to finish by just summing up, really, that I think with what I'm describing is reframing. We have to look at the world in a different way. And if once we've reframed, we need to rebuild and redefine. I think that's really important. So my 3 R's are 3 phases, and I think they're urgent. And we can only reframe by completely redefining the nature of learning. And I'll finish on this slide. This is a picture I took in Tokyo, and I kind of like it because I always imagine the person who bought that car, they went and bought the smallest car they could possibly find, and they drove it home proudly and reversed it into their garage, and it still didn't fit. Now, my view is that that person is an optimist. Better to have half the car in the garage than no car in the garage. Better to have half a car being protected than not having a car at all. And in some ways, learning is a bit like that. It's the car that doesn't quite fit in the garage in the organizations. And we can kind of lament our fate and bang on the table and demand to be given a voice, or we can just get on with it and help that transformation and use our insights that we gain from field work to do the best job that we possibly can. for the most people that we possibly can, and create vibrant organizations which make us more human, and in making us more human, make us more engaged, make us able to create vibrant, evolving organizations that can survive in this current environment. So thanks very much. Thanks for sticking with me, and I really hope the rest of the conference goes well. I'll be back again for a panel session, but until then, good luck with the rest of it. Over to you, Dave.